Well, let's go ahead and get started here. It is my pleasure, as you know, we have another guest speaker today, PaulBrehm, who's got a joint appointment in both environmental studies and economics. And in this class, obviously, we spend a lot of time thinking about different perspectives, different ways of thinking about the environment, but also different ways of solving environmental problems, the sort of broad suite of tools we have. And I'll admit that sometimes I'm critical of certain ways in which economists view the world, especially economists who sort of believe that market forces will naturally solve all of our problems. There are, fortunately for us, fields, not even a field, I will say fields of economics that focus on the issue of how do we use market tools to effectively solve environmental problems, to, if you will, bring about more sustainable relationships between humans and the natural world. And I think most of us who have any level of deep engagement in environmental studies understand that the tools of economics are absolutely essential to solving our problems. And normally I give a presentation on economics, which is probably a little bit biased from the view of an ecologist. We thought this time we would bring in a genuine economist to share. They're a bona fide economist, an individual with a degree in economics from University of Michigan, undergraduate degree in econ and math from one of our peer institutions, Vassar College, but someone who deeply studies, issues of resource extraction, resource use, and the economics associated with trying to bring those into alignment with what might be more sustainable. For those of you who find after today, or maybe even before today, economic approaches of interest, I strongly encourage you to think about some of the upper level courses that Paul teaches in environmental economics. I believe over the last, 15 or 20 years, if you look at the most popular double majors with environmental studies, I think biology is still the most common double major, but I think econ may be second to that in terms of double majors. The point is a lot of students come to recognize that the tools of economics are super, super valuable in helping us figure out ways to efficiency. Econ is very much about efficiency, but to efficiently solve our problems. So Paul teaches the version sections of the intro econ course. If you are interested in economics, I would say, Paul might say differently, but I would say if you can take his course, you're probably better off in his section than other people's sections, because he will naturally, based on his personal interests, probably use more environmental examples, although it'll cover the same materials that other people do. But if that interests you, he teaches courses in environmental economics, sort of intermediate level course, and then energy economics, an upper level course, and does lots of research on resource issues. So without further ado, I did want to say a couple things, just reminders that I've been receiving various emails from you on sort of like challenges you're having with finalizing your interviews and wrapping that stuff up. Please do keep Harriet and I completely in the loop. We are doing our very best to support students who are experiencing challenges with that, and we will continue to do that, but we can't help you unless you let us know what's going on. Officially, what you should be doing now is transitioning towards making your content you developed from your interview available to your group members for feedback. So that's sort of like officially what's next. So if you are somehow a little bit late in that process, it's actually very important that you communicate with your group members and just keep them apprised of where you are so that they will know when you are ready for them to review your material, since we're not all sort of lockstep at the same stage here. But again, please let Harriet and I both know, email both of us at the same time, because we help in different ways with any challenges you're facing on that. This would be a good weekend to get together with your group mates and begin thinking about your final presentation in the class and what content you think would be useful for that. We really want that to be sort of a discussion among your group where you guys sort of review the content thoughtfully that you've developed and consider, what is really illustrating core communication principles, what's really powerful in terms of content that was developed that's really going to meet the overall objective. So do budget time to do that. Okay, without further ado, I am passing things on to my colleague, PaulBrehm.
Thank you so much, John. Good morning, dental folks.
I'm sorry, I just want to make absolutely sure we're good on this.
I think we are not recording.
So
it's a good thing you checked.
Why are we not recording? Usually it does that by default.
Oh, no.
Yeah, no,
It's
we're
recording.
Okay,
We're going.
we're good.
All right. Good to see you. A bunch of you I already know. A bunch of you I hope to know in the near future. So I appreciate the introduction, John. Thank you so much. As he mentioned, I am the environmental economist here at Oberlin, jointly appointed in environmental studies and economics. I teach a vertically integrated suite of courses, starting out at 101, going into 231. For those of you who have already taken 231, some of today's class will not be news to you, but some parts might be. And then at the higher levels, I have energy economics and a seminar in environmental and energy economics. And so today's class is going to be drawn from essentially the full suite of courses that I offer here at Oberlin. If you are interested in learning more about economics, as John pointed out, 101 would be your best first stop. And I teach that as well as a range of other faculty members in the economics department. So you folks should buckle up. There is a lot of content packed in here, and I really hope that you interrupt me with questions. If you're on Zoom, I'm probably not paying very much attention to the little Zoom window. Just shout out whatever you want to know. I am very happy to be interrupted and touch base on whatever is important to you. We are doing this class ultimately for your benefit. And so please join in whenever you have a question or a comment or a concern. So we'll start with a short intro. This is my aggressive objective for today. First, think about the role of economics in analyzing the environment. Why am I here? Talk a little bit about some basic economics tools, supply, demand, and externalities. Think about some more advanced tools like valuing the environment. Then we will apply our tools to climate change. And if time, we'll think about an example of an emissions trading market. We can also think about carbon taxes and equity, which is an important implication of having a carbon tax, its effects on equity. So why is economics relevant to the environment? Economists broadly think there are three reasons. The first one is that economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources, where the environment is definitely scarce, in the sense that the atmosphere can only take so much carbon. We have put lots of carbon dioxide in it beyond essentially its carrying capacity, and we are now in trouble because we are overusing this resource. Second reason is that most pollution is the result of economic activity. You could think about an economy creating waste, and it might be useful to have somebody around who understands economic activities. And then the third reason is that augmenting markets could help resolve overuse of the environment. This is where we're headed today, where we'll be thinking about ways to get polluters to take into account the pollution that they cause, hopefully affecting behavioral change and less pollution going forward. So, our basic tools. I should start, I think, with the basics of supply and demand. I see my titles are getting cut off up here. Let me see if I can just more. Uh-oh.
High floating, yeah, go back to that. It's a high floating.
There we go. Perfect. The expert, not myself. John is the expert in many things around here. I am the guest. So a market is going to be a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. So we could think about a market as being made up of all the buyers and sellers of gasoline in Northeast Ohio. Millions of people purchase gasoline in Northeast Ohio, and there are dozens of firms that are selling gasoline in Northeast Ohio. Now, we're going to be thinking about putting a little bit of structure on the market, try to model it a little bit. And so we're going to need representation of the buyers and the sellers and their, I guess, willingness to trade gasoline. And so a demand curve is going to represent the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded, how much people want to buy. Generally speaking, if the price is higher, people are willing to buy less of a thing. So if the price of gasoline is $10 a gallon, I might buy a little bit of it. And if the price of gasoline is $2 a gallon, I might find additional places to drive. I might be willing to pay, to purchase additional quantities of gasoline. And then the supply curve is going to represent the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied, where this is going to be a relationship where the willingness to sell, the willingness to supply is going to increase with the price. That is to say that suppliers are generally firms that like to make money, and they will supply extra quantities of gasoline if the price is higher. And so what we can do is we can put together our demand curve and our supply curve, and then think about how the market will, I guess, end up. So we have our demand curve here, the downward sloping relationship between the price of gasoline and the gasoline quantity that is demanded. We can also think about the demand curve as representing the marginal private benefit. Your willingness to pay is tied to how much you get from owning the gasoline. And so the first couple units of gasoline, people are probably willing to pay a lot for. You could think about, whatever's going to power an ambulance. That's very valuable gasoline. People would be willing to pay a lot for. And then as the price falls, the willingness to pay falls. Sorry, as the price falls, the quantity that people are willing to buy increases. What I first said was tautological. And then the supply curve is upward sloping here, where we see at higher prices, firms are willing to supply more and more gasoline. And so the market is going to tend to wind up at the intersection of these two lines. Economists are going to call this the equilibrium. And there's going to be a market clearing price, P star, and a market clearing quantity, Q star. And so everybody is going to end up paying P star, which is roughly, it'll vary a little bit because our market definition is a little bit broader here. We could think about micro markets. But if you go around Northeast Ohio, gasoline is basically $4 a gallon. And so the people over here who have a really high willingness to pay or a really low willingness to sell, they're going to trade the gasoline. And there are going to be a bunch of benefits that are accrued here. Society is probably better off if our ambulances have gasoline. And the people selling the gasoline are going to be better off because they're selling it for more than it's worth to them. We're ignoring the negative externality for a moment, hold on the pollution. And so what we find is that as we go to the right here, the benefits to society are going to decrease. Over here, just before Q star, the willingness to pay is a little bit above P star. The willingness to sell is a little bit below. The gains to society aren't as much here. And then we get to the market clearing price. And what we see to the right of this point is that the gasoline isn't going to be traded. And it's also not gasoline that would make us better off. Here it's something where the supplier might need, $8 to get the gasoline to you, and the person buying it would only value it at $3. And so that's not going to make either potential market participant better off. So this quantity is traded. Over to the right is not traded, and we wind up at P star and Q star. Any questions on this slide? We're going to think about the pollution next. So I really want you folks to be on board with how a market functions. All right. Please, again, aggressively interrupt me if you have questions or concerns. Just want to talk about something. So this point in a regular market without a market failure or externalities or whatever is going to be the efficient point. This is going to maximize total surplus for society. But sometimes this efficient point is, this outcome is not going to be the efficient point. This is our equilibrium. This is where we would expect to get to. But it's also going to be the case that we can have market failure. A situation where the market clearing equilibrium is not the efficient outcome. And so externalities are an important source of market failure. If you take 101 or more advanced econ classes, you'll learn about other ones like monopolies, so on and so forth. We're going to be focusing on externalities today. And so an externality is going to occur when one person's actions affect a bystander's well-being. Those actions are not reflected through the price mechanism. That is, the effects are external to the market in question. That is, I buy gasoline from Chris, and through our market, we are negatively affecting Henry, who was not involved in the market. I know a couple, as I may just. So negative externalities occur when one agent's actions negatively affect others and the others are uncompensated. The others potentially outside of markets. Can anybody give me an example of a negative externality? Yes. So I really like that example. Pollution floating over to Africa definitely is going to cause a negative externality for people who live in Africa. It's also the case that you could think about negative externalities occurring more locally as well, where you and I are trading in the paper mill. I'm the paper mill, you're a paper buyer. And our trade is going to be the result of some paper being made and some pollution being emitted locally. And suppose everybody on this side of the room is not involved in the paper market, or at least they're certainly not involved in our transaction. They are also going to be negatively affected from our transaction. And so what we actually have in the paper market, for example, is you and I trade, right? And that negatively affects other people. And then we trade, and that negatively affects you. So you and I have a negative effect, externality that affects her, and we have a negative externality that affects you. Similarly, you can think about gasoline market, right? when we drive our gas-powered automobiles, which I imagine many of us have, we're going to be affecting the other people in the room. And I guess those negative externalities are going to go both ways. Okay, so we got pollution from burning gasoline. We can also think about secondhand smoke, noise, generally pollution. I'm focused on pollution here, I guess, as the environmental economist. Negative externalities can take other forms, but definitely pollution is one of the main ones. For completeness, I should also think about positive externalities, another potential source of market failure. There, one agent's actions positively affect others, and the others don't have to pay for it. So we can think about vaccines, for example. You go and get your vaccine, a decision between you and your healthcare provider. And then you come to class today, and I haven't done anything, but you are less likely to get me sick because you are less likely to be sick yourself. We can think about well-kept yards. If I'm out there walking my cat and I go past a particularly nice patch of flowers, I haven't done anything, but I get to appreciate it. My cat won't go on walks. I wish I had this positive externality in my life. Or kittens. If you have kittens and I get to watch you with the kittens, but I don't have to feed them or risk being scratched, another positive externality there. Questions about this? On board with the existence of externalities? Understand them? I know we're not in Econ 101, and so I expect lots of questions. But I will keep going. I've got lots of material. Okay. So the existence of negative externalities is going to essentially mean that too much gasoline is consumed. So what we have here is, again, our supply curve and our demand curve. We talked about this as the market equilibrium. Yeah. And then what I've got on here is another line. The supply curve is the marginal private cost to the person supplying or the firm supplying gasoline. But the marginal social cost of using gasoline is higher. The social cost of gasoline is whatever it costs to make the gasoline, plus the value of the negative externality. And so this marginal social cost is going to represent, again, the private cost to the supplier plus the negative externalities to everybody else that we might care about. And so we could think about the socially efficient point as being the intersection of the social cost curve and the social benefit curve, where here I'm assuming, I guess, that the social benefits are equal to the private benefits. That is to say, there's no positive externality from using the gasoline. And so what we have here is essentially a situation where we're consuming too much gasoline, right? This is where we end up. And if we consumed less, we would be better off. What we find at this last unit of gasoline consumed is that the benefit to society is right here, and the cost to society is right up there. So it's making us worse off. I don't think this is, too hard to match up with reality, right? I think it's pretty clear we're emitting too much carbon dioxide. That's why we have, too much climate change. So what I want to think about right now is the development of this social cost curve. How do we know what those negative externalities, I guess, are valued? How much damage are they causing? That's a tricky question. And so now we're thinking about moving into 231, environmental, where I should give a big fat warning up here. One might think of what we're going to be doing as definitely anthropocentric, and also definitely incomplete. It's going to be very hard. It's going to be imperfect. And so you might ask, why are we doing it? I think it's better than doing nothing, which maybe is what we're doing right now, right? When you go to the gas station, we pay P star. You don't think about your negative externality fee tacked on to your gallon of gas, right? And so historically, we have essentially not valued the pollution. Market does what the market does. We wind up at P star and Q star and call it a day. So environmental valuation is definitely going to be hard, as we'll see. But in its absence, what we've seen is that the environment has been ignored from a policy perspective. So, total economic value, how much we value something, can include things that are not currently traded in markets. The total value that you place on something, or your total willingness to pay, can be decomposed into a bunch of value sources. So we can think about direct use value. Suppose you go and buy a croissant. You get some direct use value for that, right? Trade it in a market. You value it at $2.50, whatever it costs. But you can get direct use value outside of market, right? Suppose you go for a walk in the woods and you appreciate your time. You didn't like most of the time give somebody $10 at the entrance to the woods or whatever. It's a little hard to know. I mean, certainly it's outside of the market framework many times. You can think about indirect use value. Here, you're not directly using something, but it is providing you with a benefit. So ecosystem service, wetlands. The wetlands south of New Orleans help to mitigate flooding in the city. That is very valuable if you live in New Orleans. But those ecosystem services, there's not like a wetlands market or something like that. We could think about option value. Maybe you're not using something right now, but you want to be able to use it in the future. The long list of national parks that I would like to visit. I've not been to Glacier. Really want to go. I value Glacier being there today because I might want to use it in the future. You can think about bequest value. Maybe I don't want to visit Glacier, but I want my son to be able to visit it when he's older. I place some value on the ability to leave Glacier National Park to those who come after me, whether it's my direct descendants or, just other people that come after us that I think should have access to it. And then we can think about existence value, where I just want polar bears to have a habitat, to exist. I do not plan to visit the polar bears. I don't want to play with them. I don't really like photography personally. Me and the polar bears are going to remain apart. But I do personally value knowing that they have a habitat. So there's a lot of stuff packed in here. And in particular, with respect to the environment, a lot of this stuff is not going to be traded in market. We're not going to have good ways of, just, oh, let's go to a Walmart and see how much the wetlands are worth or whatever. Oh, booby trap here. Now, environmental valuation does have a couple of benefits. It's going to be able to capture costs and benefits across time and incorporate uncertainty. This is really important because many environmental costs or benefits happen over long time frames. You can think about carbon dioxide emitted today. That is going to affect us a little bit today. But, a little bit every day for the next couple hundred years. If you're talking about emitting a lot of carbon today, it's going to affect us a lot of it every day over the next couple hundred years. And so environmental valuation will discount these costs to the present, allowing for intertemporal comparison. This is on its own like a week's worth of stuff that we can talk about here. This is important. It's a little tricky. How do we think about trading off intertemporally today versus tomorrow? But that's week 4 of environmental economics, ENVS 231. It's also going to be the case that many environmental outcomes are probabilistic. So you could think about increasing atmospheric carbon levels by X. Is that going to cause sea levels to rise by 1 foot or 10 feet? Probably it'll be 5.5 feet. I haven't defined X. There is some X, right? But we haven't pinned down the exact relationship between carbon emissions and melting ice caps. We know it happens. But what we can do is apply the corresponding probabilities, in essence, to create an expected damage estimate. So we could think about 5 feet receiving a bunch of weight. 1 foot or 10 feet would receive a little bit less weight because it's less likely to occur. But when you look at a lot of the climate forecast models, there's a lot of uncertainty. We know not good, but exactly how much not good is uncertain. Questions? Are you with me? Okay. So in practice, estimating environmental valuation is going to wind up being tricky. There are 2 main approaches. Stated preference methods are going to directly ask people how much they value something. So you can have a survey asking about willingness to pay to help preserve your local wetland. And then revealed preference methods are going to take data from people's decisions and extrapolate about the use value of an asset. So the expenses that you incur to visit Glacier National Park are going to reveal information about how much you value its direct use. You can think about backing out valuation by using the zonal travel cost method. Another week in Econ/ENVS 231. Of course, I should point out that stated preference methods are susceptible to bias. You could think about all of the ways your survey could go wrong. Don't ask the right question, order it not so well, don't get a representative sample, so on and so forth. And then revealed preference methods are going to be unavailable for many sources of value. And so this is definitely difficult. So what I want to do now is think about applying these tools to climate change. Carbon dioxide emissions cause a range of environmental disamenity, damage to the environment. You have direct use value reduction caused by sea levels rising, severely threatening New Orleans. My home might be flooded. It's a reduction in the direct use that I get out of living in my house. We can have indirect use value reduction from losses to tundra ecosystem services. That is, the tundra regulates the climate. It stores carbon. And when it melts, when the permafrost melts, it releases carbon into the atmosphere. So essentially, we have a positive feedback loop with negative positive, right? We emit carbon and then it causes more carbon to be emitted. We can have a bequest value reduction because you may not be able to leave glaciers to your children. You could have an existence value reduction because polar bears may no longer exist. Where I should observe again that the environmental evaluation is not going to capture the polar bear's intrinsic right to exist. That doesn't mean that is not important. It means that there are some limitations to what we can do here. I do believe the polar bears have an intrinsic right to exist, but throwing that into this model is not going to function very well. And so you might think about wanting to get accurate estimates of the things we can estimate, and then also fold in the things that we can't. Think about how to incorporate them into your model of how the world works, what we should be doing policy-wise, for example. Definitely anthropocentric. Definitely something to keep your eye on. But we can think about adding up all of the different disamenities and then figuring out how much damage a ton of carbon dioxide when released into the atmosphere causes. And we do that. The Biden administration estimates the social cost of carbon to be $51 per ton. Look this up on the White House page or whatever. That is to say, 1 ton of carbon causes $51 of damage, according to the Biden. These are going to be damages over the next couple hundred years. They're going to incorporate all of the probabilistic outcomes, and you would want it to be comprehensive, incorporating all of the different ways that the carbon dioxide damages us. I should note that there is a wide range of disagreement about the true values. My bet is that if you ask the modal economists what they thought the true social cost of carbon is, they would probably say it's $100 to $150 per ton. Biden administration is actually currently reworking this. They'll probably release an updated methodology that might be more in line with the 100 to 150 that I think most environmental economists would peg as the best guess for the right range. But you can get reasonable environmental economists who put very different amounts on this. $25 a ton, approaching the lower bound there of what most good faith environmental economists would come up with. $250 a ton, $500 a ton. Also possible estimates. So, in some sense, that's a really big range, right? Which is going to reflect a lot of the difficulties that go into this. But it's also not zero, which is where we are for a lot of policy. And so this is going to be the size of the negative externality from emitting carbon dioxide, whatever this is. So one way to integrate the social cost of carbon with policy is going to be to implement a carbon tax, where that's going to be a form of emission fee, a price or tax paid by a polluter to a regulatory agency for every unit of emissions that the polluter emits. That is to say, if you're causing $100 of damage by emitting, I guess according to the Biden administration, 2 tons of carbon, then you would owe $100. Where the objective here, or one of the objectives here, would be to get people to adjust their behavior. That's $100 that you wouldn't have to pay if you didn't emit the carbon dioxide. So we go back to our market over here, different private and social costs. A carbon tax will increase the marginal private cost. That is to say, you have to pay, whatever it costs to extract the oil, refine the oil, distribute the oil, and then you also have to pay the tax. And so what we see is that because you now have to pay this tax, the private cost will go up. In the same way that if there's a big fat tax on croissants, it's going to be more expensive to buy a croissant. And so the efficient tax would equalize private and social costs right up here. So that the private cost of gasoline reflects the cost to society. And so what we have here, how has the price changed? How does it compare to our old equilibrium? Price has gone up, right? And what happened to the quantity? It went down. So with this tax in place, people are going to not want to pay it. It's going to make things more expensive, and they will figure out other things to do. That trip that I was going to take to Chicago, maybe I'll take the train instead. So in the short run, people will drive less and buy less gas. And you'll get some movement there, but you can also get movement in the long run. I mean, I guess in some sense, it'll be the same type of movement, right? I gave you this short run example. I forego my trip to Chicago, or I use public transportation, right? But in the long run, what are some ways that people might adjust their behavior in response to higher gasoline prices? Drive less. Yeah, so they'll drive less. Yeah, absolutely. And what are some lifestyle changes that one might make? Yeah, absolutely. My gas-powered car is a lot more expensive. It's going to be more exciting for me to use a bicycle or use an electric vehicle. As a short aside, energy economics, we'll spend a lot of time exploring electricity markets. And I should observe that a lot of our electricity does still come from fossil. But over the long run, you might think about us transitioning towards pretty renewable, the base electricity grid. And then it might be away from the carbon emission. Indeed, actually, if you think about California right now, they have a considerably less carbon intensive electricity grid than, for example, Ohio. Ohio still uses lots of coal. California uses almost none. California has lots of renewables and lots of natural gas. We have lots of natural gas and lots of coal. So absolutely. You could think about buying more fuel efficient vehicles or electric vehicles. I think in the short run, you definitely get a lot of more fuel efficient vehicles. What about where you choose to live? Where do a lot of Americans choose to live right now?
Rural areas.
Rural areas, outside of cities and suburbs, right? So think about your parents. What do they do every day? They commute. And for a lot of Americans, that commute happens in a car, using lots of natural gas, not lots of gasoline. So you could think about people choosing to live closer to where they work to shorten the commute. Spend less money on the gasoline. We could also think about carpooling, right? This could happen in the short run or the long run. You can go with a friend, then your gas bill is cut in half. Now, as a short aside, because I think we really should talk about it, carbon taxes and cap and trade markets have very similar properties. The cap from a cap and trade is going to fix the quantity of pollution, where the tax fixes the cost of emitting pollution. Of course, the tax is designed to lower the quantity, and the cap and trade will essentially have a price associated with it, in the sense that if you want to pollute, you have to buy a permit. One of the things allowed under the cap and trade. So there are these differences here, but under full information, these can yield equivalent outcomes. You could think about a certain size tax getting you to roughly the same outcome as a certain size tax. Under uncertainty, one may be superior. That's a week worth of talking about. And then the other thing that I'll note is that in practice, cap and trade systems frequently involve giving permits to polluters, which can have welfare effects. So you can think about the European Union's emission trading system. Permits were given to people who had historically emitted pollution. This was justified by observing that they were going to be most negatively affected. There's a lot of interesting economics research. It appears that in the early days, perhaps too many permits were given away. Both from a didn't cut as much carbon dioxide as we could have standpoint, but also from a maybe the polluters' profits went up due to the implementation of the program. So let me give an example of an emissions trading market. I'll actually give two short ones. Are there any questions at this point? I mean, I got a bunch. Yes.
Also with the example of the carbon tax thing, like it seems like you're asking like the buyers to their lifestyle, not like
So that's an interesting question, or an interesting, I guess, observation. I think that in some sense I am focusing on the things that are more readily understandable. But if you go back here, suppose this is the tax. So I really like this question. Thank you. This is the tax. And so what that means is that the buyer pays this and the seller receives this, with the difference going to the government. And so what the seller receives is less than what they used to receive. And so there are a lot of incentives for firms as well. Both, I guess. I guess I have a couple of thoughts here, right? ExxonMobil, for example, their business is making gas, right? What you will see here is that the price that they receive goes down, the quantity that they sell goes down. So this would negatively affect ExxonMobil's profit. For ExxonMobil in particular, that might incentivize the transition towards less carbon-intensive fuels. If you can get natural gas instead of oil and use it for the same thing, the natural gas has like half as much carbon dioxide. BP, British Petroleum. What do they call themselves now? Does anybody know? No. So they are rebranding themselves beyond petroleum, not necessarily because of a carbon tax, but maybe due to expected policy changes, where they understand that the petroleum is in some sense fleeting, so they're looking towards alternative forms of energy they can extract. I think there's another point here too, though, which is that I've been talking a lot about how you and I might respond, but we don't make up all of the carbon, right? So you can think about how businesses operate as well. In particular, the price of diesel is really high right now. And in the long run, people might shift logistics networks away from diesel heavy trucks towards something else. But firms are profit maximizing entities, and carbon just became more expensive to emit. Profit maximizing firms like to cut costs. So they will look to cut carbon dioxide. Any other questions? I really appreciate that. Thank you. So let me give an example of an emissions trading market here. Before I do that, where this is going to be a cap and trade, but we just discussed how it can function very similarly to a tax. I want to think about sulfur dioxide and local health consequences. Where SO2 is a colorless gas that is a major pollutant from coal-fired power plants. Some other places as well. SO2 is soluble, dissolves in the respiratory tract to form sulfuric acid, which can burn the lungs. Long-term exposure can cause severely impaired lung function. SO2 can also contribute to heart attacks and strokes. And as a consequence, power plants are required to have high smokestacks so that the pollutant is not deposited nearby. Indeed, if you go out to the OMLPS plant in South Oberlin, used to be coal-fired, the smokestacks go up. And so this is going to create a transboundary air pollution problem. These high smokestacks are going to deposit sulfur dioxide up in the atmosphere. And then the wind is going to carry it over hundreds or thousands of miles. The SO2 is going to be removed from the atmosphere through conversion to sulfuric acid, which dissolves in rain and snow, causing acid rain, which is going to have serious effects on lakes, streams, forests, crops, buildings, sculptures, so on and so forth. And so the EPA implemented an emissions trading program for sulfur dioxide in the US. Affected units, coal-fired power plants mostly, were required to own allowances to emit SO2 after January 1st, 1995, when the program started. If you didn't have a permit, you were fined $2,000 per ton. And power plants were required to install monitoring equipment to continuously record emissions. You can get this data for any coal-fired power plant in the US, how much SO2 they're emitting every hour. Really nice source of data for research. And the permits were allocated based on baseline fuel consumption from 1985 to 1987. That is to say, coal-fired power plants were given an allowance. And so here are sulfur dioxide emissions over time. Now, 1995 is somewhere up here. We did have some decreases, other approaches. But what we've seen is that sulfur dioxide emissions have gone way down following the implementation of the program. From 12 million tons to 6 million tons. That was the cap being tightened over time. We allow 12 million tons here. Then we allow 10 million tons, 8 million tons, and so on and so forth. Tighten the cap over time. And what we have seen is a large reduction in SO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Which is to say that since I was born, or I'm not that old, SO2 concentrations have fallen by more than half. Again, this graph continues for the next 10 years, although the 2010s have been really about programs other than the cap and trade program. EPA has shifted for a range of reasons. I'm not going to get into it today. Are you folks familiar with unleaded gasoline? That's what you buy at the gas station, the cheap stuff. Why is it called unleaded gasoline? Anybody know? Yes, yes. But why don't we call it unchaired gasoline? Or unsofaed gasoline? Yeah, that's right. So the absence of lead was an innovation. We figured out that lead was not so good for us. And we figured out, hey, maybe we should get it out of our gasoline so that it's not, combusted and then breathed in by everybody who's near the car. So lead in gasoline started with a cap and trade. Like 1980, we were allowed to have, 1 million pounds of lead in our national gasoline supply. And then they cut the cap every year until about 1986, at which point the cap was 0. No lead in our gas. And now everybody just calls it unleaded because 40 years ago, we used to have lead in our gasoline. So the last thing I want to think about here today is carbon taxes and equity. Oh, I do. I am so sorry. Please, thank you.
I was wondering about how you talked about positive and negative externalisms earlier. So with unleaded lead being something that's positive in the sense that it protects people's health, because lead is dangerous, that being positive, but also being a negative impact in terms of the environment and how that has pollution with it as well. Where does that fall in the realm of the positive and negative?
I really appreciate that. Thank you. That's a great question. So let me go back. You can tell economists love their models. So here we've got our private costs and our negative our social costs, including these negative externalities. In 1975, gasoline had, at least as far as we've talked about today, 2 negative externalities. There are more, I assure you. When you burned gasoline, you emitted lead and carbon dioxide and a bunch of other stuff. And when we removed the lead from the gasoline supply, we essentially eliminated one of the negative externalities. And so really, can you folks see that? It used to be that our marginal social cost line was up here. And so what we did was reduce the total set of negative externalities associated with gasoline and brought down the social cost. So you could imagine, suppose we had carbon-free gasoline, which is not coming as far as I know. But suppose we got rid of all the pollution associated with gasoline, then we'd essentially be eliminating the negative externalities, and our market would just be represented by the marginal private cost and the marginal private benefit, which is going to roughly resemble the croissant market, right? When I go and get a croissant, I don't think to myself, oh shit, I'm really going to hurt John with this. But when I fill up my tank, I'm cognizant that, hey, this is having a negative effect on other people. Maybe I should be careful about how I use my gas. Now, of course, you know, relying on people understanding that seems to be insufficient, right? Most people accept gasoline as not so good, but we still have lots of carbon dioxide. So the tax here is key. That's the point. So, any other questions? Carbon taxes and equity. As a percentage of expenditures, less wealthy individuals spend more on carbon intensive goods. That is to say, rich people definitely emit more carbon, but as a percentage of their budget, it's smaller. And so what that means is that if you implemented a carbon tax, you might find that wealthy people end up paying 1% of their income, and less wealthy people end up paying 2 or 3% of their income. So one might want to think through carefully the equity or inequity properties of this type of policy. Where the tax revenue's use is going to play a really important role in determining the equity properties of a carbon. That is to say, there are 2 sides to this policy: the taxing and the revenue generation, and then the revenue expenditures. We're assuming that the US government isn't going to not spend the money, which seems reasonable. So, what could we use the tax revenue for? What are some things? Where I want to point out that money is fungible and any revenue source can be used to fund any expenditure. Go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, I'm so excited. Well, I mean, think about it. Yeah.
Could you spend it on ways to like decrease people's need to use carbon?
Yeah. So you could definitely think about putting that money towards reducing the, I guess, demand or need for carbon dioxide. That's a very popular and very common approach. Build a bunch of wind farms, or subsidize electric vehicles or electric bikes. Absolutely. Are there other things that we could do with the money? What about the equity concern? Is there a way we could address the equity concern? Got a lot of money. Equity concern is that some people, less wealthy people, are paying a lot of money, right? What could you do with the money? I can't tell if we're being.
I mean, this is really broad and I don't know how feasible, but like, you just could be as well.
Yeah, exactly. Right? I mean, you could take that money and then use it to, I mean, I guess in a couple of ways. I'll give you folks a couple of examples here. You could have a revenue neutral tax, which takes all that money and returns it to each household on a, equal basis. So every household in America gets $600 a year. I guess it might be $2,000 a year if a household has like 3 or 4 people, whatever. And there you are addressing some of the equity concerns, right? You would be thinking about wealthy people are still spending more absolute dollars, but they receive the same amount back. So let's say you are wealthy and I am less wealthy. I'm spending $1,000 on carbon taxes. You're spending $3,000 on carbon taxes. We're both getting $2,000 back. We could also think about using the money to increase the earned income tax credit. This is an important anti-poverty program. If you're earning the minimum wage or a wage below a certain threshold, then you get a tax credit. Think about a single parent working minimum wage job, 40 hours a week all year. The EITC pushes their effective wage from $7.25 an hour, minimum wage, up to $10 an hour. That is to say, the EITC gives them about $5,000 from tax time. You can think about the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or commonly known as food stamps. You could use the money to subsidize the additional wind farms. You could use it to cut taxes on homeowners. These are going to have different equity properties. But it's important for thinking about the policy as a whole, right? You could use the money directly to address homelessness in California. I have somehow, I think, made it through all of my slides, which is like a never. Questions, comments, complaints, objections. John! Oh no, hold on, students first, please.
Are there ways to give back like that tax money, like not directly giving it back to households, but rather reinvesting it in more like access to resources for communities?
Yeah, absolutely. You could think about a billion ways that the revenue is potentially spent, right? The US government budget is trillions of dollars. All of those programs are funded either by taxing or printing money. And so borrowing money, I guess. John.
No. I want to go back, way back in what you were talking about uncertainty with respect to climate change and the challenges of sort of thinking about pricing a future when there's uncertainty. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were saying that was the two sides of uncertainty, which I'd like you to comment on. One being scientific uncertainty, which is, I think, something that's talked a great deal about, as opposed to, scientific uncertainty about if we emit so much carbon, this much ice will melt, as opposed to what I think, and that's what I think the general public thinks about generally when you talk about like uncertainty. They think, well, the scientists don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
My own sense, but they don't know what's going to happen when you emit so much carbon. Whereas my own sense is that's been narrowing considerably, and that almost all of the important uncertainty is on what the hell are we going to do about it? And so when you say we could be here or we could be here in 30 years, it's much less about what scientists know about the impacts of CO2 in the atmosphere than it is about the complete uncertainty of will human beings get their shit together to do something about it.
Oh yeah, I mean, so definitely a couple of thoughts. The first one is, I don't think, and I hope I wasn't representing it this way, that there is sufficient scientific uncertainty to say maybe we shouldn't do anything. I do think that there is a big question about, well, I don't even know if I would say big, right? But suppose you were to think about this example that I put up right here. I think we have a pretty good idea that it will be, for X, somewhere between 4 and 7 or something. And all of those are bad. 7 is obviously worse than 4, but like bad. We want to be thinking about approaching it and doing something about it. And I guess my follow-up is to say, hey, look, here is something environmental economists are excited about that we've known about for like lots of years, and we've done nothing about it. And so I absolutely think that in some sense, some of the policy prescriptions or approaches are well understood, and there's a lot of problem implementing the policy. So the EU emissions trading scheme, right? That's been in place for like 18 years or whatever with varying degrees of success. The US does not have a national cap and trade or carbon tax, right? We have some regional ones, RGGI, probably haven't heard of that. That's in the Northeast. It's because it doesn't really do as much as we would like it to. California has a program that might be working a little bit more effectively. So I do not disagree with you in the sense that like we have a good idea of how to tackle this and we're not. And that's the problem.
My comment wasn't so much a disagreement with you as it was, it seems to me like the way economists think about these things, those two uncertainties are really different from each other. I was more kind of encouraging you to talk a little bit about how economists deal with the uncertainty of what we're going to do about it. This one was more focused on the uncertainty. I mean, what you don't know is whether and how people will address it. That's a whole issue in of itself in terms of where you go with that. Lack of knowledge about what will people do at regional, national, local scale, and how do you play that out?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, and maybe this is a punt that you're not going to be very excited about, but in some sense, this is getting into the politics of it. You can think about Australia. They passed a carbon tax in like 2010 and then repealed the carbon tax in 2012. And we can say a lot about what the policy did during the year and a half it was in place and what it would have done if the policy had remained in place. But like I guess my expertise is not in how can we make US Congress function better. I have some personal opinions. I don't have a PhD in that. I do have an opinion that US Congress does not function well. But like, I guess I would say that is outside my PhD, and we're now just talking to Paul Brehm, guy on the street, which is fine. I'm very excited about that guy. But I don't have a 45, 70-minute presentation talking about how Congress can function better. So that is a punt. But like, do I think that is a super critical issue? Yes. And I guess I do want to not overstate its importance, but the US is obviously a major polluter, but we are one of the major polluters. And so, you know, in some sense, this is an issue that's a little bit broader than just can America get its shit together. It's, you know, lots of, yeah.
Wouldn't it make like more sense to just like get rid of like coal subsidies and stuff like that, and like oil subsidies?
Yeah, so
it seems just kind of like an extra step to do all of this before we do that.
So a couple of thoughts. Coal and oil subsidies, what that essentially does is it would push the marginal private costs down. And so, yeah, you would be thinking about returning it up here. My sense is that the subsidies for like coal and oil extraction are pretty small relative to the subsidy of being allowed to pollute for free. And so I think that the carbon tax would be a lot more meaningful in terms of pushing up costs. That said, there is also an important question around energy security. And so you could think about Eastern Europe right now, and you could think about the interdependence with Russia and some of the ways that's playing out negatively. And so I do think there are some really important considerations there. And I think that we're seeing, you know, pretty awful things because, for example, Germany decided to get most of their energy from Russia, which is like what the, you know, we've known Russia was not nice for a long freaking time. Was there another question? Did I miss it? Are we declaring victory? I think we're there. Have an awesome day, gentle folks. I've got another class.